This is the E-Commerce Edge podcast with your host, Jason Greenwood. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the E-Commerce Edge. And I've got a fantastic guest lined up for you today. I'd like for you to welcome Gurudev KARANTH from Out of the Blue. Welcome, Gurudev.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks. Looking forward to this conversation here.
It's fantastic to have you along for the ride with me today. And before we get into Out of the Blue and what you do and what triggered this, where you were scratching an itch or whatever, how did you get to even be in this digital/e-commerce space? What's your background? What led you down this beautiful garden path of e-commerce?
Yeah, so I've spent 20 plus years of my life on e-commerce, spent 5 years at Target, 7 years at eBay, a year at PayPal, a year at PayU. So payments, e-commerce. And before that, I was doing a startup in the search engine marketing space. And we did have a couple of folks that were trying to sell online. So back in 2000, that's what I was working on. And 7 years at eBay, you're in the weeds, e-commerce wise. And then from a Target perspective, then it opens your horizon a little bit, where you start looking at not only e-commerce, but also the retail aspect of e-commerce and how everything comes together. And that guest buying behavior is not about just one channel. It's about a need and a problem that they have, or something that they're looking to basically get for themselves, right? And how do you make that whole process frictionless, easy? And understanding that is pretty fascinating.
And man, this whole thing, I think, around better understanding customer intent, better understanding your sales and performance analytics, better understanding individual channel performance, better understanding your unit economics, all of these things are what lead ultimately to building a sustainable business that is making enough profit on every single order, or at least in aggregate, making enough profit to be able to survive as a brand. And when we look back across your experience, look, you've done some pretty big stuff. You've done some really big stuff. When you were at Target, the final role you had with Target, Senior Director, Digital Data Sciences and Analytics, Experimentation, Targeting, and Measurement Product. This is a pretty big remit, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I was wearing two hats. On one side, I should support the business and solve day-to-day business problems. But on the other side, how do we build capabilities that help solve business problems? So I was able to look at it from two different perspectives. And that's very important, because typically, if you just look at it from one perspective, you miss the other side, right? Every coin has two sides, right? So you need to look at it from an overall view, and that really helped, right? And that's where you can build the best product, but if the best product is not working or is not solving a problem, how do you get that feedback, right? So that's where, from a Target perspective, it really helped me open my perspectives in terms of putting myself in the customer shoes and putting myself in the operator shoes to understand what's really the day-to-day problem that folks face, right?
And it's my understanding and my assumption that when you get into these very large retailers, like you've worked inside of Target, is a gigantic retailer across the whole of the United States. And it's my understanding that when you're working inside these very large brands, and especially when they're omni-channel like Target is, that usually from an analytics and an MTA perspective, and even from an M perspective, that usually most of the tooling that they're using internally for these analytics projects, they're bespoke tooling. Okay, maybe they use a data lake, or maybe they use something like Snowflake, or they use something like that. But from a BI perspective, as I understand it, they're usually plumbing all of this data into something like Power BI or Tableau or some other data analytics and visualization platform that then they are slicing and dicing all the data that's flowing in from all of these different data sources, whether that's Google, whether that's Meta, whether that is their own e-commerce platforms, whether that's their point of sale, ERP, whatever their sources of data are, they are plumbing this into BI tooling that then they slice and dice that data for all the different needs that they have in the business. Am I understanding how that typically goes, and why that model doesn't necessarily scale down to SMBs, because that kind of infrastructure takes a lot of time to set up and it's very expensive, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's a journey, right? Especially for these larger organizations. When I started at Target, we were using Adobe, right, for data collection, just given an example. But then when I exited Target, we had a homegrown system. Why? Because we had to basically capture our own data in our own way and make this available across the enterprise, right? Similarly, when we talk about experimentation, when I started, Target was using 3 different experimentation platforms, one for store, one for mobile apps, one for web. And what we realized is now we're just getting siloed views of the problem, right? But at the end of the day, it's the guest doesn't care. The guest looks at it. I'm buying from Target, right? I can get an item shipped to store. I can actually pick it up in the store. And measurement now becomes very bespoke, right? Because you're trying to now connect a lot of these dots together, right? So that's where I think evolution wise, the problems that the targets of the world have are definitely a lot more challenging as such, right? But taking that same digital experience, if we start talking about e-commerce, from e-commerce perspective, there is a lot more to what most tools, most brands use. If you're using Google Analytics, yes, you're going to get some basic information, but then you're limited by what Google Analytics captures. And that's where, if you have better data, you get better insights. If you get better insights, you make better decisions. And if you make better decisions, then it helps accelerate time to value. And that's what separates the better brands from the not so well performing brands, right? And that's where I feel that we are trying to bring that capability down to each of the smaller brands, where we're saying, let's automate this process, because your ability to get an insight drives business value.
And we're also running into a situation where Google Analytics just isn't that user-friendly anymore. It's basically, if you want to implement Google Analytics and you want to do proper tagging and tracking, and you want to implement GTM, and you want to really have a holistic view of clickstream analytics, you really need a developer. It used to be Universal Analytics was pretty straightforward. It was pretty easy, pre-GTM era, and it was all last touch attribution, and it was all pretty clean. And Google was much more transparent about their data, even in Merchant Center, and the world was good, right? But now there's a war on cookies. There's a war on attribution. Every platform wants to take credit for a conversion, and so therefore now we have the complexity of MTA. We have the complexity of buyer journeys crossing across multiple channels, both ad channels as well as transactional channels, before they complete a purchase. So the consideration set is broader and deeper than it's ever been before. So really what we're saying is that the ability to capture and synthesize data in a meaningful way is just gotten orders of magnitude harder to do, right?
Absolutely. Not only do you need a developer, you need an analyst who understands your data, who understands your business, and you need both of those for magic to happen, right? Otherwise, you're stuck, right? If you don't have either or, if you have the best data, don't have the right analyst, doesn't matter, right? If you have the best analyst, not the right data, doesn't matter, right? And that's where the value of data by itself without insights is zero. The value of data with the right insight is infinity, right?
Yeah, no question about that. And that's a beautiful segue into Out of the Blue and what you guys are developing at Out of the Blue. And full transparency, I've never worked with Out of the Blue before, but at least based on what it says on the tin, it says capturing revenue that you are leaving on the table. And it's your assertion that most e-commerce brands are leaking around 14% of revenue. And your pitch, your UVP of Out of the Blue is that merchants can leverage AI to detect revenue impacting events 24/7 to get alerted as they happen.
Absolutely. And what we're saying is, for you to detect these events, today you have to go to a dashboard. You have to first have the thought in your head saying that, hey, I'm going to look for this. And then you need to go to the dashboard, and then you need to be able to connect the dots, and then you need to detect something's going on. So we see that the ability, the going back to the point that you were making, the surface area of what you need to look at as a brand is increasing, because in most cases, most brands are working with at least 15 to 20 SaaS tools. If there is signal loss between any of the two systems that you're using, it can happen because there's an authorization failure. It can happen because someone changed their spec and they're expecting information in one way, you're sending information the other way. Any of these things means that there's signal loss. If there's signal loss, you will have scenarios where your Klaviyo remarketing campaigns are not sending the right volume of emails. How do you know this? Until you go into Klaviyo, and until you basically check that this is really happening, you don't know a lot of these issues, right? So that's one class of issue, right? The second class of issue is just experience, right? You're using Shopify for your add to cart flows, and if it's not working for a specific mobile device, you don't know. The issue has to be large enough for you to detect it. And even then, you need to have someone looking at this all the time, or you need to have the right alerting in place. And building alerting is not an easy problem, right? Because we've all tried this in all our lives and our previous lives. And if you set up static alerts, you get too many alerts, then you're like, you lose focus. So getting the right alert delivered at the right time is a challenge in itself. And
No
the complexity
question.
of systems is really is where it's at.
And it's growing exponentially. And then we have different types of systems that I think today, I know, even speaking for myself, and I consider myself pretty technical, knowing as a small and medium-sized brand, for example, knowing which system to implement and how to leverage it to make sure that, because oftentimes these systems can disagree with each other. They can disagree and the data can disagree. And so sometimes doing predictive analytics, doing RFM modeling, doing different types of predictive analytics versus looking at historical analytics, each of these platforms seem to do their own thing. And we've had, even on just my podcast alone, we've had Clar, Store Hero, Wicked Reports, Provalytics, LifeSite, Funnelytics, and every other kind of analytics platform under the sun that you can imagine. But they, every analytics, and particularly performance analytics platforms, they all seem to do things in a slightly different way. So from your perspective, what was the gap you saw in the market that made you go, actually, I think given my experience, given my history in retail, omni-channel retail, given the challenges that I already faced in having to build bespoke systems to be able to analyze data at scale and drive decision-making out of that data, what was it that said to you, there's nothing out there that really does what I think needs to be done in the market, so I'm going to create out of the blue instead?
Absolutely. And then that's a great question. And the analogy I'll provide is, you can be the person sitting on top of the hill looking across the valleys, and you can basically detect smoke, you can detect fire. But if you're in a valley and trying to detect fire, if you just see smoke and it's coming from a different valley, you're not able to connect the dots. And typically what we're seeing is, because there are so many tools, it's become increasingly difficult for a growth marketer or a brand or a founder or an agency to connect all these dots. Everyone's using Excel sheets. They're dumping information from each of these tools into Google Sheets. They're doing the analysis that way. And you're just looking at part of the problem. And every time you look at a part of the problem, you're not connecting the dots. And that's where I think we're looking at it from a perspective of, you need access to the right tools. We need to centralize the information. We need to connect the dots to tell you the right story. And it's a difficult problem, right? You need all of these things to work. And that's what we are trying to do in terms of our ability to not only identify and standardize the problems, because the problems are consistent across brands. Every brand faces the same problem. So how do we productize a lot of these offerings in order to drive value on a day-to-day basis?
And do you consider yourself more of a marketing performance analysis tool? Where do you consider yourself an MTA, a multi-touch attribution tool? Do you consider yourself a predictive analytics tool, a CLV tool? Where do you classify yourself? What is your kind of pitch to the world when someone is inside of a brand and they're saying, hey, look, I need to monitor my marketing performance and my marketing spend, both organic as well as paid and performance. I need to look at individual channel performance. I need to make sure that my unit economics make sense. Where am I finding incremental revenue increases? How am I controlling my cost structures to make sure that I'm building a sustainable business? And then we have platforms like Northbeam, et cetera, that are trying to deal with a cookieless world. So and then we have CDPs, which are trying to capture a whole ton of behavioral data so that we can then segment, and then we can tell platforms like Meta and Google which lists of customers we want them to create lookalikes based on, instead of just trusting them instead and trusting their targeting, when we know that their targeting is all about making their lives better and making them more money, not necessarily about making us more money. So there's a lot of things for business owners, leaders, and marketers to think about when we're thinking about this holistic measurement of performance across the business. So where do you feel like you're plugging gaps in businesses today that is really difficult to do?
So what we're focusing on is the pre-order flow, right? And what we're saying is a brand makes revenue. A brand actually needs to sell for them to grow the top line, right? And to grow the top line itself, there are many aspects to it. And what we're focusing on is primarily the pre-order flow, right? From a pre-order flow perspective, it is very important to understand the acquisition side of things and conversion side of things. And that's where we're focusing right now. And the idea is that as we scale this, then we can start looking at the merchandising side of things. We can look at the operation side of things. We can look at the inventory side of things. But that's all future problems for us because we are going deep into not only detecting what is changing, but also telling you, okay, where is it changing? And then if we can tell you why it is changing, where we can connect the dots to you saying, hey, you shipped a new piece of code and it's actually broken this part of your funnel. And that's what we're looking at. So MTA is one part of it, acquisition is one part of it, but we're focusing on how do I generate insights consistently so that you're getting the right traffic, you're converting the right traffic continues to come back, right? As a brand, what we are eventually going to is we are leading towards is that saying that for a brand to grow, three things need to happen. One is they need to be able to grow their active users, which means that they're able to add new users and they're churning that and new user ads are less than the number of users churned. Second aspect is ensuring profitable acquisition, which means that your LTV has to be greater than your CAC. And the third aspect is focusing on LTV growth itself, which is where how do I get users to come back? How do I get my repeat purchases going? How do I increase my AOV? Can I reduce my time to purchase? How do I increase my frequency of purchase? So on and so forth. And in order to do this, it's a hard problem because now, in order to connect the dots across all these tools, you get one piece of information in this one platform, one piece of information in each ad campaign, and that's what we're trying to connect the dots and say as a brand, these are the areas where you're weak at. And summarizing this information is a very hard problem, and with AI, it's becoming a lot more easier. So that's where we're investing into Gen AI to be able to connect these dots and say that these playbooks that we can implement for you so that as a brand you can start automating these functions, but still ways to go in order to get there, but that's the path that we're on.
That's the vision. That's the vision. Amazing. And so if we think about when somebody comes to you for the first time, it sounds like they're potentially trying to kill two birds with one stone. They're trying to better understand attribution, and they're trying to do some sort of conversion rate optimization exercise. So they're trying to analyze conversion, and they're trying to make that better, and they're trying to make sure that where they're spending money, both from a maybe an organic and a performance perspective, where is that money being best spent? Is there a third leg to the stool, which is the predictive modeling and predictive analytics and maybe predictive analytics? Or is that something that you guys don't really, you're primarily looking at historic behaviors as opposed to predicting future behaviors? Am I understanding that right?
So two parts to the equation, right? We are using a lot of the historical data to start forecasting where you need to be, which is predicting where you need to be. And saying that if you're on this trajectory, this is where you're going to go. But doing that level of forecasting and prediction is, and it's all AI for us, right? And that's very important because how do I know I'm actually off target, right? How do I know if I'm actually beating my target? How do I know if I'm under target? And today, everyone, there are tools like Polar Analytics, we just put like a target value. And yeah, meaning, yes, you can look at it, but then for you to basically understand why you getting there and what are the factors leading up to it is where I think it's a very manual process. They need to hire an analyst to do this. And that's where we're focusing on our first use case, which is revenue capture. And we're saying that as a brand, one way to basically grow your top line is to prevent leakage. And as a brand, you're leaking money, right? And these are things that are low hanging fruit that you can address. And in most cases, if you knew them, you would address them. But the cost basis for you to basically identify this means that you need to get an analyst. You need to have the right data. You need to do a lot of these things in order to capitalize on it. And today, as a brand, you may not have that, right? You may not have that knowledge. You may not have that perspective. You may not know what to look at because just too many moving parts.
And when we start thinking about the sources of data that you guys are getting data from, what are the channels where you're pulling data from? I'm guessing it's the ad platforms, it's the Googles, it's the Metas, it's the Amazons. And then I'm guessing You're also pulling transactional data from either the e-commerce website, the ERP, maybe the point of sale systems. You're also pulling data, I'm guessing, from any attribution platforms that may already be in play, potentially pulling data from CDPs or marketing automation platforms, or potentially pushing data out to them in some instances. So when we think about the data sources that you're typically encountering in your day-to-day work, where are you seeing the most success in terms of synthesizing that data?
So we're starting off with the CDPs and Shopify data to start with, right? And that's where there is the most data and everything is built on it, right? And then you can layer on additional pieces of information like your ad campaigns and so on and so forth. But the CDP tells you what's going on, right? It tells you it's the underlying basis of it. So we're embedding a partner CDP into our solution, and the idea is that we're able to now not only understand what exactly is going on every step in the user buying journey, but also tell you where users are struggling. And now you can activate a bunch of use cases because everyone does this differently, right? What SaaS apps am I going to enable in terms of enabling data activation use cases, be it in terms of email, SMS marketing, be it in terms of attribution, be it in terms of retargeting. And a lot of this information comes back, right? Retargeting, remarketing, because if you're retargeting, then you need to get that feedback that is really working. While you're activating these use cases, these also become data sources.
Hey team, I have a big favor to ask you. Please pause this episode and send the link of this episode to someone you know that you think would enjoy this content. Really appreciate you spreading the word. This is how we grow. We're not a Joe Rogan. We don't have big, massive advertising budgets, but we absolutely want to grow. We want to get the learnings from all of these episodes out to as wide of an audience as possible, and we need your help to do it. Thank you, and now back to your listening. Yeah, makes sense. And so what are the kinds of data points, KPIs, and what type of activities and I guess behavioral metrics and channel metrics? What are the types of metrics that you are typically looking at to try to connect the dots between and find anomalies where they occur so that those can be surfaced in real time to the merchant? What are the types of areas that you guys are really heavily focused on?
Yeah. So the three parts of the equation, right? You would probably look at a lot of your metrics throughout the funnel, right? Every step in the funnel, the transition rates, so on and so forth. But there's also acquisition rates. Where are folks landing? Where are they exiting? What are they doing in between? Of the folks who are making it all the way down through the funnel, saying that through add to cart, right? A typical Shopify conversion rate is 1.4%, right? And if you start looking at the best performing brands on Shopify itself, they're 7, 8, 9%, right? So which means that for the same investment of marketing, for the same investment, you're getting 5x the return at least. And what separates the better brands from the other brands, right? And some of this is having the right access to the right data, right? But also these metrics and these ways to look at analysis is what unlocks value.
And so for you guys, when you think about tracking user behavior, how are you responding or adapting to a cookieless world, a privacy-first world? I won't even get into the whole that I think privacy is a myth anyway. But apart from that, everybody seems to be going down this privacy-first path, and the walled gardens seem to be getting the walled gardens seem to be growing and increasing in size and scale. And when we start thinking about how we track users in a cookieless world, when we start thinking of IP addresses, when we start thinking of thumbprint.js, when we start thinking of all the ways in which we might be able to build a model of understanding which users are taking which actions, how are you guys dealing with that? How are you guys dealing with this privacy first world model?
So many aspects to that. So at the end of the day, user permissions are paramount, right? But you can start looking at each individual interaction as an analytics tool. You're also getting you can also look at it in aggregate, right? In terms of what's happening in aggregate. And that's what most experimentation tools, that's where the value of experimentation versus the value of personalization, right? How do I personalize events for a specific user is where you can unlock one leg of growth. But if you start looking at things in aggregate, you start seeing patterns that are happening across multitude of users. Now you can start looking at slow moving changes and fast moving changes, right? Certain things and you can detect these very easily in aggregate data. right? And that's where I look at it from a perspective of we are the guys who will tell you, who'll zoom out and will tell you what's changing overall, right? And a lot of these are not necessarily tied to individual users, which is where the privacy and security aspects come in. These are looking at things in aggregate, yes. And that's where we have the first party cookies, so on and so forth, opt-in, all of those things that are coming in. The regulations are only going to evolve, right? And it's becoming increasingly interesting to see how the smaller brands are actually getting a multi-device view of things as well, right? Because you're doing certain interactions on your app, you're doing certain interactions on your website. And if you go into the omni-channel, you're going into the store, right? And how do you start looking at it? You know exactly who's purchased what, right? That's all the brands have that information, right? Because you know who the buyers are. But then by looking at it in aggregate, how do you start driving change to differentiate between things that are working and producing the outcome versus things that are not working and not producing the outcome?
And what are some of the types? Give me some examples of the types of alerts and insights that your platform would typically generate. You have one example shown on your website, 50% spike down in GMV over a specific time window, and that would trigger off an alert. Hey, you need to really look at what's going on here because you had a massive drop in GMV over, say, a 30-day window or a 7-day window or whatever it might be over the time period. And therefore, you need to look into this. You need to find out why that is. Have some of your admin campaigns, for example, been automatically disabled by Facebook for some kind of infringement that you didn't even know was happening, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the types of, give maybe 4 or 5 examples of the types of actionable insights that your platform would typically generate for merchants?
Yeah, so what we would basically we would look at different aspects, right? We start with, are you delivering the right experience to start with, right? Meaning, which kind of translates to, are is there any change in page views, which is the initial part of the experience itself, right? Then you can start building on it and saying, on top of if I'm serving the right experience, are users engaging the same way or are they engaging differently? Which is where you start getting into engagement, which kind of gets into, am I bouncing off this page more? Am I bouncing off this page lesser? Where there is something changed in the drop off throughout the buying funnel as such. The third aspect that we bring in is navigation itself, right? And navigation is also another aspect because everyone buys differently. Some people come to the site many times. Some people actually buy it on their first session. They exactly know what they're looking for, right? Now you marry this with top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, and bottom of the funnel. Now you start overlaying things differently and you start seeing, okay, now how does all of this come together, right? So GMV at the end of the day, if you're sending more traffic and it's not resulting in more buying behavior, that means that there is some step in the funnel that is actually soaking a lot of this additional traffic, which means you're spending more, getting less, right? So that's where we want to focus on. And some of these are we reaching out to the right folks, right? Because if you start doing retargeting to these folks and you start doing your audience sync and you build a lookalike audiences and so on and so forth, are we basically leveraging the value of that? Is that working? Is it not working? Do we have the right message, right? If you don't have the right message, even though you're sending the right messages to folks, it's not necessarily translating to additional revenue as such. So these are the different steps that we look at. And then we're trying to break it down as to, is this happening by a certain type of user? Is it happening for a certain category of product? Is it happening for a certain type of device? Is it happening for a certain step in the funnel where a certain type of content or a certain offer is not necessarily working? And these are all changes that come in, right? So there is a lot of metadata, there are a lot of changes that you do. And then there is a lot of, and as you make these changes, you expect everything to actually work well. Right? But there are two sides to the story. There's the unintended impact of change, there's unintended impact of change. And a lot of people actually don't think about the unintended impact of change. Shit happens, right? And when shit happens, you need to basically know that shit has happened so that you can act on it.
Yeah, no question about it. And what are some of the things that your customers might be asking you for today that the platform doesn't do yet? And what is on your roadmap to add to the platform over the next, say, 6, 12, 18 months? What's high on your priority list to enhance and extend the platform?
So I feel that we're just starting off on a journey. We're very early in our evolution. The idea is that we want to be able to automate a lot of these detection and monitoring and root cause analysis, right? Which is where we are focusing on right now. But root cause analysis is you really need to get into causation versus correlation, right? And we can see evidence of something, but then what does that evidence, what's driving that evidence? And that's where it's a hard problem. And that's what we're spending time on. I feel that causality is an important aspect for businesses to drive the right action. And it's a hard problem. And that's what we're looking to solve. And we've made great progress on it, but still a long way to go. And that's one part of the equation. The second part of the equation is automatically setting the capabilities for us to bring in different data sets that kind of provide the explainers that brands need. And today in the dashboard, in the world of dashboards, either you have dashboards that are too complex, that provide too little value and take too much time to learn, or folks who are really struggling to understand and translate the business problem to how do I access this data. So that's where we are at right now. How do I dumb it down? How do I make it simple for a marketer? Because things have just gotten insanely complex for a growth marketer to actually run their brand, or a CRO to even run their brand.
And do you have any vision of trying to make your connections with these endpoints bidirectional? Meaning, as of today, the data all comes from these platforms, and then you furnish the insights, you surface the insights, you make recommendations, and then the marketer has to go into the Metas, they have to go into the Googles of the world, they have to go into these channels, and they have to make the changes. They have to make the changes in the content, they have to make changes in the ad spend, in the targeting, etc. Do you have any vision of basically almost making like a one-click actionable system whereby, okay, this is what we recommend you change, but then we're going to connect to the Meta API, for example, or we're going to connect to the Google Ads API. We're actually going to make those changes to those ad campaigns, to those ad groups, to the suppressed keywords, to the negative keywords, to is it your vision to ultimately action those insights on behalf of the marketer where they approve it? Or is it always your vision to simply be a aggregator of data that then you run a cohort analysis on, surface the insights, and then let the marketer take the action manually themselves?
Great question. I think the value is in driving the right action for as far as an end user is concerned. But then to drive the right action, you need to have the right confidence, because if you're trying to drive decisions with lower confidence, then you could make the wrong decisions. So there will always be a class of solution where a class of action where we will actually defer to the brand in terms of surfacing the insights, but there will be decisions that we will start automating. And that's where the world is going, right? Like when you are a Rabbit R1 device is more about driving actions. You tell them, this is what I want. And we can actually use Gen AI and in order to basically complete those end-to-end flows. And that's where the magic is. Because even if you tell a brand and they don't have the resources to drive this change, you're still leaking revenue. You're still not capturing, they're leaving money on the table.
Yeah, in order to do more with less, maybe we've got to have AI agents doing the work on our behalf. And so that's I guess the future is AI surfaces the insights, and then with our permission, it goes away and actions on the insights, all automatically, all via API.
Absolutely. And wherever there's high trust, folks will bring that automation in. And wherever it's low trust, it's like self-driving today. We have self-driving cars to some extent. 10 years back, none of this existed. So we're trusting algorithms to do more and more. The question, but it is a journey, right? And especially in e-commerce, margins are real razor thin, high costs. So how do you basically capitalize on increasing the lifetime value for the user and keeping your acquisition costs lower is probably where magic will happen.
And as of today, you've got integrations with Shopify and Shopify Plus, BigQuery, Redshift, Klaviyo, Blotout, Google, Facebook, Meta, Instagram, Pinterest, TikTok ads, GA4. If we look out over the next, say, 12 months, what are high priority integrations to add to this list? On the e-commerce front, pretty thin on the ground, Shopify only. Are there any other e-commerce platforms that are high on your priority list to integrate with this year in 2024?
Yeah, so what we see is as brands get larger, they start creating their own data warehouse. And as they create their own data warehouse, they have their own ETLs in place in terms of bringing data in. But as we work with smaller brands, we see that they're still connecting to each of these tools, each of these dashboards, and bringing information into their Google Sheets. And as you work with the larger brands, there's also the tools like Adobe Analytics and that they use, the mixed panels of the world, the segments of the world. So we feel that there is a lot of value to be unlocked by leveraging CDPs itself, and there are lots of them for marketing use cases, for technology use cases, and so on and so forth. So we expect to to go into multiple CDPs over time. We have a partner that we actually embed, which is brought out. And in addition to that, we are also looking at going into the Snowflakes of the world and so on and so forth, and making this very standard for brands depending on where they're at. So we'll meet the brands where they're at. And that's really a function of the pull and the inbound value that we drive.
Makes complete sense. And when we think about pricing and what a brand can expect to pay for your platform and your services, as I understand it, it's based on a rev share model, right? So it's based on total stores annual revenue, is how you price your platform. So what does that look like from a percentage perspective or a tier perspective or whatever? What can a brand expect to pay to use your platform?
Good question. We're still early in our value equation. We're still figuring it out. But the idea is that the revenue capture product needs to be something simple that I don't have to think about. It's like insurance. When you buy a new car, you want to make sure that you're accounting for the dings and everything else. So the revenue capture product is really designed to be low priced, tied to brand revenue, and starting as little as $999 a month, right? But then as you start going into the data and analytics platform and getting a lot of the other aspects going, the larger brands are paying up to $10 million a year annually for the larger platforms that are out there. So we expect to lower the overall cost of analytics stack for each of these brands. And that's where we're working through, because in today's modern data stack, there are lots of tools, and lots of tools costs add up pretty quickly. And before you realize, your cost equation is more than what you need to be. So that's where we're looking at a partnership with a bunch of brands in terms of actually coming up with an end-to-end unified stack from data collection to your data warehouse to your automated analytics, so that as a brand, you're able to basically lower your costs, drive more value.
Yep, makes sense. And how do you like people to get a hold of you? I'll drop your LinkedIn link into the show notes. I'll drop your website link into the show notes. Other than that, how do you like people to get a hold of you and reach out and have a conversation about performance analytics for their business?
Absolutely. Email's great. Send me a text message. LinkedIn's great. I'm reachable. I'm looking to hear about problems that folks face, because I've been spending a lot of time in this space, and I feel that in today's day and world, the complexity has only increased, and I'd love to hear your problems and solve them for you.
Yep, and you're based in the mighty city of San Francisco, and you've been working on Out of the Blue for 3 years now. So it's a labor of love.
Absolutely. Absolutely. After spending 20 years in this space, 3 years is still...
It's a small percentage, but hopefully big help based on that experience. Amazing. Listen, Gurudev, it's been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot about Out of the Blue and what you intend to do with it and the value you're trying to bring to merchants out there in the market struggling with trying to figure out what initiatives are we doing in the business that are actually moving the needle and which ones aren't, or which ones are moving the needle in the wrong way fast. So this has been a great conversation. We've dug deep into some pretty cool areas. Now we're at the point of the conversation where I get to flip the script. I get to hand the microphone over to you. I get to let you ask me one question, any question you like, it can be personal or professional. So Gurudev KARANTH from Out of the Blue, what is your question for me today?
So my question is, I see you're doing a lot of this on the e-commerce. So what's your driver for doing this? And I'd love to understand your rationale for doing this podcast and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there's a few different motivators about why I started the podcast, why I continue to do it, why I continue to make such a massive investment in time in it. One of them is I didn't see, when I looked out across the pantheon of e-commerce podcasts out there, I didn't see a lot of people focusing on tech and ops. And that's a real passion of mine. Tech and ops are a massive area of focus for me and my consulting work, et cetera. And most of the podcasts I saw out there, they were focusing on like merchant stories, digital marketing, and that sort of stuff. They weren't focusing on necessarily operations. There's a podcast out there called The Operators, which I also really like. There's a few podcasts out there, but they didn't really have the niche bent that I think I have. And based on my 20 plus years of doing this, I'd like to think I bring a unique conversation to the table that wasn't being had out there until I started doing this. Secondly, it opens up an opportunity for me to meet people like you and other really smart people in the industry and have conversations with them. And outside of having a podcast, it's really hard to get people in the industry to just have a virtual coffee with you. You slide into their DMs and you ask them to have a virtual coffee. And look, oftentimes they rightly think that you're going to pitch them or you're going to try to sell to them or you're going to try to partner with them, whatever the case may be. And so to just have a genuine conversation where there's two-way learning going on, that's difficult to do outside of a podcast environment, especially the podcast environment, because it's more long form, it's more deep dive instead of these quick little snippets. I find that this is a really great format to be able to get deeper into a conversation with someone. And then finally, it allows me to demonstrate a level of expertise, hopefully based on experience, that at the end of the day, it also drives business for my business. It drives demand for my business and my services as a consultant in the industry. So I'd like to think that it's multi-pronged, but really for me, it's the joy of conversation that I wouldn't be able to generate this type of conversation any other way.
No, that's awesome. And with AI, your tech world is only growing, right? It's going to become front and center for everything out there.
It is. And look, Gen AI, maybe one day I'll have a Gen AI agent that is having a conversation with your Gen AI agent, and we have this conversation completely agent to agent. But I think that'll be a sad day when that happens. And I think that there is still going to be a market for this free flow of thought, this format, this style of free flow of thought. I think it's going to be a long time until AI to AI can have free form conversations like this. And so I think AI is good at lots of things. Two-way conversation, even with ChatGPT, etc. It's not a two-way conversation. It's a question. It's a question and answer conversation. It is not a two-way conversation. And I think that's what makes humans special.
Absolutely. No, AI is basically good at automating functions, rote functions that are repetitive in nature, right? It's great at that, right? But when it comes to a lot of cognitive stuff, you need to provide the guardrails, right? If you don't provide the guardrail, you can fire in all directions.
That's right. That's right. Gurudev, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I can't wait to do it again soon. Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.